All right, I just thought I'd give a little slideshow for you guys on the Protestant Reformation. It's a complex event, and the textbook does a pretty good job at outlining some of the causes and effects of it, but I just wanted to highlight some of the major concepts, the major causes, major effects here for you. So, not so black and white, I've titled this here, just to reflect the idea that it's a complex event. It's very easy to simplify things, but whenever we simplify things, we distort them. And I'm going to simplify some things here on this slideshow. So obviously that's going to distort things a little bit, but I'll do my best to keep it straightforward. So the event that symbolizes the Reformation often is the sale of indulgences. And here we have an illustration. This is the event that really pushes Martin Luther to break away from the church. So here you see an illustration of some church officials, and they're carrying, you see it's kind of a sign, and there's a document with some wax seals and strings hanging from it, and that's an indulgence. The indulgences were forgiveness for sins, and it's based on the idea in the Catholic faith that, of course, everyone is sinful, and nobody really quite is in a proper state to get into heaven when they die. But most people, if they're practicing Catholics, the Catholic Church teaches that they will get into heaven, but they just have to purge away their sins. So they go to purgatory. They go to a place of punishment, and they're there for a certain amount of time based on how many sins they have to purge away and how egregious those sins were. And the idea was that you could limit or reduce the amount of time that you had in purgatory. And one of the ways you could do that was by doing good works while you were alive. So the theory goes that if you give money to the church, and then the church does good things with that money, feeding the poor and taking care of widows and orphans and such, then you're doing something good. But what happens is during the Renaissance, the Catholic Church is so desperate for money that it really just turns into this money-making scheme where people buy the indulgences and they're given time off in purgatory, and it really becomes quite corrupt. And it does symbolize the reasons why many European Christians decided to break away. But there's a lot more to it than just that. So it's a shorthand way to remember it. It's a simple way to remember it, but it's not the true whole picture. So there's another textbook. We're not using it. It's the main author is a guy named Palmer, and he identifies three streams that lead to the Reformation. And these are kind of social and economic, basically lower class, middle class, upper class. He makes the case that basically people at all levels of society, by 1500 or so, there's widespread discontent with the church. At the bottom, you have the peasants, the commoners, who are just, every time they turn around, they're paying taxes or fees or feudal dues, and they're giving a fair chunk of their money to the church. And some of the people in the common class are starting to get a little fed up with every time they turn around. They've got nobles, they've got now the new monarchs and the church that's imposing rules and requiring fees, and people are getting a little weary of that. At the same time, you have the rise of the middle class in the late Middle Ages into the Renaissance, and you have this, to a certain degree, literate class, and they're businessmen, they're craftsmen, they're in charge of their business, they're used to making their own decisions, and especially once you get the printing press in the mid-1400s, there's a demand for people to have access to the Bible printed in the vernacular, in the language they speak, so that they can take a look at this thing and see what it is that the Scripture says they should do. The Catholic Church at the time took the position that the Bible is a complex document, and if you can't read it in the original language, you probably can't properly understand it, and so you need this kind of middleman. You need the priests to be able to explain it to you. But increasingly, you get this educated middle class in places like England and northern parts of Germany and in Switzerland and parts of France that really want to have access, more direct access to this spiritual document to guide their own growth. And then finally, you have people at the top of the ladder, the kings and the princes, who are really resentful of the power and the wealth of the Catholic Church. And this has been going on for a long time, this secular versus temporal authority, secular versus spiritual authority, the non-religious versus the religious authority. And with the rise of the new monarchs, you start to get some people who are powerful enough to really start pushing back in a coordinated way against the power of the church. And so they see the Reformation as a chance to kind of pry some of that wealth and power away from the Catholic Church. Now, you picked up in the chapter 11 and chapter 12, you picked up some of the roots of the Reformation. During the Black Plague, of course, you have in some areas a third or more of the people dying. And the Catholic Church is supposed to help these people out. They're supposed to deliver to them the sacraments, the holy rituals that are really in the Catholic faith. The key to salvation is faith, but also it's good works, and it's also participation in these sacraments. And some of the Catholic clergy, they're human beings. They're terrified of what they see, and they flee. They fail their duties, and it undermines people's trust in the church. At the same time, you have this great schism, or schism, both are acceptable pronunciations. You have this crisis with the papacy, where there's a French pope who moves the seat of the Catholic Church to Avignon in France, and is really infamous for the corruption. And so then you have a second pope who is elected to try and replace him, but neither pope steps down. And then you actually even get a third pope before it all gets sorted out, before there's the conciliar movement, the councils that depose everybody and put someone else in charge and kind of clear it all up. But in the meantime, you have the head of the Catholic Church in Avignon and the head of the Catholic Church in Rome, and each one says that if you listen to the other guy, then I'm going to excommunicate you and your soul will be damned. And it undermines the faith. It looks petty, and people start to think that, maybe this isn't such a great system that we've got. And so people start to look for other ways to worship and other ways to think about their faith. And as you know, in the Renaissance chapter, it talks a lot about some of the corruption. Obviously, not all of the Catholic clergy is corrupt, but enough are that there's a widespread appearance of corruption, and enough of the people at the top are corrupt that it really just kind of penetrates the whole system. You have people buying and selling church offices. That's the called simony, Simony. And the reason people are willing to pay money to become a priest or a bishop is because a lot of wealth flows through their hands, and so then they can skim some off the top. And then you have pluralism, where a priest might hold 3 or 4 offices, which leads to the problem of absenteeism. If a priest is supposed to be on 3 or 4 different parishes on the same Sunday, he obviously can't do that. And so people really, right down to the common level, they show up to church on Sunday and there's nobody there, or the priest has put in a substitute who really doesn't know what he's doing. Some of these are called dumb dog preachers. Some of them actually literally can't even read or write. And so this really creates a situation where people are quite unhappy with the spiritual services they're getting. And 2 of these early reformers are the English reformer John Wycliffe and the Bohemian reformer John Huss. Sometimes you see it as John, John, or sometimes you see it as I've spelled it here, Jan. Same guy. And both of them are trying to reform the church. They're not trying to break the church. They're trying to change it. Wycliffe manages to escape the wrath of the church. He's in England, which is kind of a backwater at that time. Jan Hus, though, he's in Bohemia, and he's too close to the Holy Roman Empire and to Rome, and he winds up being summoned. He's promised safe passage if he comes and explains himself. And he explains himself, and they don't like his answer, and so Jan Hus is executed. He's burned at the stake. And he's just a little too early. He's about 100 years before Luther. And the problem with both of these guys is that they don't have access to a printing press. They're both before the printing press, and so they can't spread their ideas very quickly. But here we go. Here's a picture of an early printing press. A very simple machine, but very powerful, can make books very cheap to print. Not just books, but what are called broadsheets, which are kind of like pamphlets or early newspapers. And so you have this new technology combined with Renaissance humanism, this idea of understanding, explaining the world, questioning the world a little bit. And you get people like Erasmus, who's a very sincere Catholic. He never becomes Protestant, but there's the expression Erasmus laid the egg and Luther hatched it. But Erasmus says that the church has gotten too complex, too corrupt, and it needs to return to a simpler, a purer version of Christianity. And he paves the way, many people would say, for Martin Luther. Martin Luther, the German monk, he's a Catholic. He sets out not wanting to break the church. He wants to fix it. Um, he tries really hard to be a good Catholic, a good monk. He goes to Rome and sees this awful corruption. He goes back to the German states and he sees the sale of the Indulgences. He sees Johann Tetzel walking around selling the Indulgences. You know, the guy's a con man, Tetzel is. He's snake oil salesman. And Luther gets upset and he writes his 95 theses, his 95 arguments. And supposedly he goes and nails them to the church door. We don't actually know if he did that or not, but even if he does that, it's not as bad as if you went to the city hall and nailed something to the door, or the local church and nailed something to the door. It's actually what people did back then. People who were intellectuals, if they wanted to sort of start a debate, they would go and they would nail their proposition to the door. It was kind of a bulletin board. It's the intellectual center of a community, the local church. And so anyway, he goes and he publishes these 95 theses, and a lot of people in what's now Germany, in the German states, really like what he has to say. Particularly some of these German princes really like the idea that he's challenging the authority of the Pope and by extension the authority of the Holy Roman Emperor. And so Luther's message gets spread very quickly by the printing press. And when Luther is summoned to explain himself at the Diet of Worms, it looks like Diet of Worms, but it's Diet, which means meeting, in the city of Worms, in what's now Germany. And he explains himself, and he's probably going to wind up dead if the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor had their way, but he's convinced enough people by then that he's actually protected by some of the German princes, and so Luther is able to continue preaching and spreading his word. And then we have Henry VIII, and this is an interesting guy. He's actually a very good Catholic for most of his life, but he has this crisis related to the fact that his wife, Catherine of Aragon, from a very powerful family, from the Habsburg family, who is incapable, in Henry's view, of producing a boy. She has several children, only one of them lives, their daughter Mary. And so Henry decides to try and put the marriage aside so he can marry someone younger, and hopefully that this younger woman would bear a son. Now, it's not just sexism on Henry's part. Remember, the Tudor monarchy had only been in place since the time of Henry's father, Henry VII, in 1485. And so, there's still a lot of people floating around there in England who think they could do a better job, and their claim to the title is as strong as Henry's. And so he's worried that when he dies, that his daughter will be overthrown, and his family will be a short-lived dynasty, and he'll kind of be forgotten in the history books. So he's trying to secure his family's place in history. So he writes to the Pope and he says, well, the marriage to Catherine never should have happened because she was engaged to my brother before he died, and the Bible says you should never marry your brother's widow, and so this is God's way of punishing me for doing this, and so we should annul the marriage. And he thinks the Pope, because Henry's such a great Catholic, the Pope's called him defender of the faith, he thinks the Pope's going to go along with it, but of course Catherine of Aragon wants no part of it, and she writes to the Holy Roman Emperor, who is a Habsburg, and says, go put some pressure on the Pope and don't let him do this. And so the Pope writes back to Henry and says, no, can do. So that's when Henry starts his own faith, the Anglican or Church of England. But he's really modeling it very closely after the Catholic faith. The big difference is instead of the Pope being at the top, the monarch is at the top. But Henry realizes now, since he controls the church in England and all the wealth, and theoretically in Ireland, although his control of Ireland is kind of tenuous, he then can confiscate all the church lands, all the monasteries, and all the businesses. The church, not only did it hold property, but it owned all kinds of businesses. It owned mills that the peasants would have to pay to grind their wheat into flour. It owned breweries and vineyards and orchards, and all this wealth passes into Henry's hands, and he uses this to secure his position, to buy friends and influence people. So anyway, so these are some of the immediate causes in the early Reformation in the German states and in England. Now, there are some specific intellectual critiques. It's not just about money, although it's partly about money. And people like Martin Luther believe quite strongly that they're really, it's about an intellectual critique and a spiritual critique. The corruption I've already talked about, the Indulgences. One of the arguments that Protestants, Catholics had was about the sacraments, these holy rituals. In the Catholic Church, there are 7 sacraments, and a Catholic does not need to participate in all of them to be saved. One of them is marriage. You don't have to get married in the Catholic Church, but if you do, it should be within the sacrament of marriage. The other is taking the holy orders, becoming a priest or a nun. But the other sacraments you're supposed to participate in. But Martin Luther and the other Protestants, they look at the Bible and they say, nah, we only see really 2 sacraments. We see confession, excuse me, not confession, we see baptism, and we see communion, which is commemorating the sacrifice of Jesus with bread and wine. Jesus is said to have passed around bread and wine and said, this is my body, this is my blood. But even the Protestants argue about what exactly that means. The Catholics say that the bread that's being passed around when Jesus says, this is my body, and when he passes around the wine, he says, this is my blood, that this is actually literally the body and blood. This is what's called transubstantiation. Many of the early Protestants, like Luther, say, well, it's not actually literally body and blood. But it's spiritually, it does have more than just bread and wine in it. And this is called consubstantiation. Protestants a little bit later say that actually it's just memorialism. It's neither transubstantiation nor consubstantiation. It's just a symbol, a play, a reminder of the sacrifice. And so this is one of the arguments people have. And this is a very serious argument. People kill each other over this. The means of salvation. This is really important. Catholics believed and still believe that you need a combination of faith and good works to achieve salvation. Martin Luther comes along and he gives this doctrine of salvation by faith alone. You choose to have true faith and then you're saved. It doesn't matter really what you do. You don't have to do all these rituals if you have true faith. You should try and do these rituals, the ones that they believe in, but it's not the rituals that get you into heaven. A little later on, John Calvin comes along and he has the doctrine of predestination, this idea that when you have an omniscient God, when you have God that knows everything that ever happened or ever will happen, that God knows what you're going to do from before you're born. And God has already determined from before you're born whether you'll be saved or damned. And nothing you can do can save that, can change that. And faith is a gift that God can give you or not give you, but true faith is not something you can choose to have. It's also something you cannot reject. You can't say, well, God wants to give me this gift, but nah, I don't want it, right? You have to accept it. So this isn't a very comfortable doctrine for many people, but a lot of the early Protestants look at this and say, well, he's got a point. If you have an omniscient God, you can't fake God out. You can't say, well, you thought I was going to be damned, but guess what? I'm saved, right? So it's an argument that people have, and this is the early argument that really kind of divides the Protestants and keeps them from making a united front against the Catholics. There's also some elements of Catholic faith that are rejected by all Protestants. The idea of purgatory. Protestants say, no, there's heaven and hell, there's no in-between. And Catholics also believe that some people are given by God a special gift. These are the saints. They're given the power to perform miracles. And when those people die, the physical remains of their bodies, bits of bone, hair, blood, that they retain some of this power to inspire people and actually to heal people. And again, Catholics are the only ones who use that system of beliefs. Now, some Protestants call themselves saints, but by that they mean they're like the early saints. They're the early Christians. They're trying to live like the disciples did, the first followers of Jesus. They don't believe that they're saints in the Catholic sense, that they can perform miracles. One of the big differences is the hierarchy, the power structure in the church. If you imagine a triangle, the Catholic Church hierarchy is like a triangle with one person at the top, the Pope, and then you have cardinals. There's not many of those, and they're the next most powerful. Archbishops and bishops and priests. Protestant churches differ on this. The Anglican or Church of England is very similar to the Catholic Church, except the monarch is the head and there are no cardinals. And then you have the Lutherans, and they have bishops and priests, but no cardinals and no one person at the head. And then you have people like the Calvinists who just have ministers. They don't have bishops at all. And then you have, even in the late 17th century, you have the Quakers who say you shouldn't even have ministers. You shouldn't have anyone between you and God. You should have a direct connection. And then finally, this comes up on the exam sometimes, women's roles. and how women's roles change as a result of the Reformation. Initially, actually, women have a reduced role as a result of the Reformation. In the Catholic Church, women can be nuns, and nuns, they run their own convents, they can run businesses through the convents, they get education, they can pursue an intellectual life, and actually, it's an opportunity for women that's taken away by the Protestants when they dissolve, when they say, no, there shouldn't be any nuns, and women's main role really is motherhood and marriage and motherhood and raising children up in a Christian way. Now, of course, in the 20th and 21st century, that changes, and a number of Protestant churches expand women's roles and allow women to become ministers and bishops and such. But in the 16th and 17th, 18th, 19th century, you don't see that. You don't see those opportunities for women. So actually, it becomes somewhat more limited for women as a result of the Reformation. So 3 people that you really need to know related to Protestant successes: Martin Luther, Henry VIII, and John Calvin. Really make an effort to learn how each of these 3 men is related. There are some other people who are quite important, but if you get a question about the Protestant Reformation on the exam and it refers to one of these guys, there really is an expectation that you would be able to discuss at length how each of these 3 men contributed to the Reformation, what their ideas were. And you might also get a question about how did Catholics react? And the initial reaction is, as you see in this image, to react by the way the Catholic Church always did to what they considered heresy. You root it out. You have an inquisition. You try and find people that are attacking the church, and you suppress them. You torture them or execute them if need be. But they realized pretty quickly that this wasn't going to do the trick, that this was something bigger than they'd ever seen before. So they call a council. It's actually a series of councils called the Council of Trent. And the Council of Trent decides that, you know, the Protestants have kind of a point about this corruption. We need to clean this up. But they reaffirm their spiritual beliefs, the Catholic beliefs about purgatory, the saints, the 7 sacraments. They remain unchanged down to today. And they create new religious orders like the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, created by Ignatius Loyola, to go out and try and combat Protestantism. These are some of the most highly trained, really intellectually rigorous priests that go out and risk their lives to go and try and convert people back. And their big success story is in Poland, which was starting to become Protestant, but the Jesuits go in there and they really kind of turn things around. But it's a dangerous place to be Catholic in Protestant countries, and it's a dangerous place to be Protestant in Catholic countries. This is a very violent time, not a time of religious tolerance at all. And so we see ultimately, once whole areas become Protestant, you see some organized conflict result. You see peasant revolt in the Holy Roman Empire in 1525 or so that ironically Martin Luther condemns, because he thinks that, you know, his Reformation is just a spiritual one, that the peasants are trying to make this into an economic and social and political revolution, and he doesn't want that. You see the War of the Three Henries in France. This is illustrated here with this illustration of the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, when Catholics massacred Protestants. But you have French Calvinists known as Huguenots and French Catholics battling one another in these wars. And ultimately, a group called the Politiques, by the end of the 16th century, decides that it's really not worth it, that they're destroying France, and there needs to be a certain measure of religious toleration that is embodied in Henry IV, who was a Protestant, and he becomes Catholic so that he can become king of France, and he publishes the Edict of Nantes, which says that Protestants have a certain degree of religious freedom. In the Holy Roman Empire, you see a series of wars in the 1500s, and then we'll get into this a little later, the 30 Years' War, which tears apart the Holy Roman Empire. It's really pretty much evenly divided between Protestant and Catholic, and there's really no compromise in that situation, and it destroys this political institution and really affects Central Europe down through the ages. It actually leads to, in part, to what's called German militarism, and even the world wars, and even the way the world is shaped today is really partly the result of these religious conflicts in the Holy Roman Empire. And in England, you have, it's a fluid situation for a little while. Henry VIII, He goes through several wives. He's 6 wives in all. 2 of them he divorces, 2 he executes, 1 dies, and 1 outlives him. And out of all those wives, he has 3 kids that live. Mary and Elizabeth is the next that lives, and then finally a son, Edward. And so when Henry dies, his son Edward, a Protestant, takes over, but he dies very young. And his half-sister Mary, the Catholic, takes over, and she's called Bloody Mary because she's on the throne for 5 years, and she executes hundreds and hundreds of Protestants. Um, she dies without children, and her sister, half-sister Elizabeth, takes over. She's a Protestant. She brings England back to Protestantism. And it's a little bit like France, where they come up with a compromise, a middle road, where the Anglican Church is similar in many ways to the Catholic Church. So the Catholics are happy enough. But most Protestants are okay with it. But there's a minority of Protestants called Puritans who really dislike this, who think that the English Church is still too much like the Catholic faith. And that's going to come up again with the English Civil War, which we'll discuss later in the course. So I hope this helps put the textbook in context and give you a little bit of some of the indication of what some of the major details that you need to look into. But it's a complex topic. So if you have any questions, send me a message, send me an email, and I'll be glad to try and clear it up. Thanks.